Are live. Welcome to Beyond the Escape. I'm Mike,
I'm Dane.
and today we're still discussing how we're making the creature compendium for our Sagaborn role-playing game. So it hasn't been that long since our last one. Have you been working on anything cool, Danny?
I've been working on notes, getting my head wrapped around the process that we're going to go through, and reviewing all the existing stuff that's that you've already put into the compendium and so forth.
Cool. Anything stand out? Anything interesting to you? Like when you're looking through
them? Well, you know, a lot of the notes are very slim. So mainly I was so far, and then at least the ones I looked at. I think you have a little bit more on the oop here and stuff like that, but a lot of them might have just like a little, couple sentences, which makes sense because that's what we have to fill in. But yeah, at least I have an idea of what it's going to look like. What the you have how you have all your stats laid out. I do think you mentioned reversing it, putting descriptions first and then stats at the bottom. But other than that, I guess that's the format that it'll be.
So something that's been puzzling me is how we go from here. Like with stats for D20 that you could look through and write descriptions based on the stats, or like, do I need to write a little bit first and then you follow up?
Yeah. So, okay. So I guess that's a good segue into what I was thinking in terms of our process and such. So I have a whole other topic I want to get into about, and because you mentioned one topic we could discuss would be what makes a good antagonist, what makes a good monster, and I have a lot of thoughts on that. And as I was laying out my thoughts, there were some things that occurred to me. Now, one thing, let me back up a little bit here before I get into this, because one thing that hit me is how interesting doing what we're doing right now is going to be, because you sent me a basic, a few topics that you had in mind, and then I had a few topics that I had been thinking about, and I want to be prepared for these conversations. So I started brainstorming, and as I was doing this, it hit me that we never go through this process. When in the stuff that we've made in the past, we've had a process that's worked well for us, but we've never dissected it. And so what I'm realizing is that this transparency, this going through the process and thinking of, coming up with what we're going to talk about in these, I think is going to be interesting, because we're going to develop a better process just by doing this. And anybody watching gets to see us improve. They get to see us progress. So, yeah, I was thinking about some of the components that I think make an interesting monster. And in thinking of that, I realized that there should be, I came up with a sort of framework for how we can approach this. So without getting into the details yet of what I consider will make a good monster, what I was thinking is that with every creature that we make, we can use some of these ideas that I have about what makes a monster effective, and I think you'll be able to add to it also. I'll put it in Google Docs. We can work on this, and with every monster, we have a little list of things to consider. And I think that one distinction with us, and this works well for the way I look at an effective monster. I think in a lot of fantasy, just as with a lot of action movies and any fantasy story, science fiction, a lot of times you have a basic a fear of mortality. You have a creature that's powerful enough to potentially kill your protagonist, or at least defeat them in some way. But not necessarily the horror components of a monster. You know what I mean? There's a distinction of, the villain that's powerful and can kill you from, say, a comic book movie versus the horror movie antagonist that fills you with dread and terror. And even though we're not making a horror story, I think you and I are in agreement that at least a lot of our monsters, we want to invoke fear. Even and people may not know, I'm editing a story right now that Mike worked on, and you make specific references to amping up the fear for the players. So I think we're in agreement there that we would like our monsters to be scary in some way, not just powerful, and not even just evil, but something that's unsettling, I guess, at least for a lot of them. I don't think they should all be like that, but a lot of them. So to that end, I broke this down. What would those components be that we can, in the abstract, that we can think, that we can filter these creatures through to come up with ideas? So first, I think that's step one. Step two is the story. So this is what you and I always do, and I think we should continue this. Now, we won't necessarily have it for every monster, because that wouldn't even make sense necessarily. Some monsters we may just have rumors of such and such or whatever. But I think without going overboard, we only have so much room to write a description. I think that it needs to be, rather than just a description of what the monster is, a little bit of, maybe the characters that are our avatars have a story where we adventured out and came across this creature, and briefly, this is what happened. Because I think telling a story about the creature brings it to life. Now a game master reading the creature compendium doesn't just have a description and then, well, now what do I do with it? How to, because then I think you end up with, they're just challenges along the way. They're not as integrated into the story as I think we would like. They're just obstacles to get past. And I think that's common in a lot of RPG gaming, is you have monsters that are just set up as obstacles and puzzles. How do we get past this? How do we succeed? And so I think by making even if it's just a little paragraph, come up with a little story about what we know about it, or somebody, and it may not be us. We couldn't have encountered all of them. So let's say that we heard a story about a child got lost out in the forest and encountered this creature. And what happened? What was the terrifying thing that happened? And of course, the story is from the perspective of whoever the survivor might be, or survivors. So
did you actually look at the apparition creature that I had done?
No, I didn't look at that one.
It's funny because that was one that was done after our last talk, and I actually wrote, it's like 2 paragraphs, but it explains what an apparition is through the character Atan describing how he killed one.
Right.
So
perfect.
Basically,
so exactly. So we make this I think we put it in Google Docs that these are the steps we're going to go through with every creature, and I think that's going to make it a lot easier. Consider all of these elements of, what would invoke fear, or at the very least, anxiety. If a player were to come across them, what is that thing that makes them so dangerous or what have you. And then what is the story that we have of the encounter? And then maybe not all of them have stories, and maybe not all of them have that thing, but at least we have something to compare them all against to give us a starting point. And I think
Right.
that'll
So
make this process go a lot easier.
that also goes along with sort of what I talked about early on, in that, like, how familiar, how, or not how good you are, but like, can you read a stat block and understand what it's saying? Because, like, one of the things is, we can write a story that talks about how scared you should be of this creature, but then part of that with writing this thing is you have to know then, well, then this creature is going to have like a DC 18 ability. Or if you see a creature that already has an ability like that, then you know how to translate that into the fiction. Or is that something that, like, we might have to go through creature by creature until you get a feel for that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely going to be some feeling our way through in the beginning.
You know, because, like, uh, for example, I just happen to have the Hellhound picked up, opened up in front of me right now. You know, and so special attacks, breath weapon, fiery bite, and those are explained as, like, a Hellhound can breathe a 10-foot cone once every 2d4 rounds. You know, damage 2d6 fire, reflex, DC 13 half. So, like, did you understand sort of what that was, or, you know, or I guess I'm just checking to see, because I know that you play so infrequently that, like, something like this. So, like, what do you
No,
think? Like,
no, I have a rough understanding. I'm definitely um still working out some of the the gameplay aspects, but I have an understanding.
okay, all right, cool. So, I mean, that's going to be one of the biggest things, is, like, a lot of these creatures already have those um, stats to them. So the fiction needs to go along with it. Or if
Right.
we add something into the fiction that says, hey, this creature needs to be, like, scary. And then part of that is also, like, for example, there's a demon called a Dretch, which is sort of like a small, blobby, gross creature that came over from the Nibirum. Um, and it actually, no, I take that back. Spell-like abilities, once per day, it can cause fear, DC 11. So just by seeing this thing, it can cause, well, not seeing it, but it once per day it can cause fear to everything around it. But it's a pretty low DC, so most things aren't going to be completely scared of it. We'd want our fiction to help the game master know how to instill that fear, you know.
Exactly.
Um, because on this guy, I always describe them whenever I'm running the game with them, like, just how gross they are, like this, like, translucent flesh with, like, boils on it, and they, you know, the players never even want to touch them, you know.
Right.
So when these guys turn towards you, it's sort of it's like graying. Or this leads into another thing that I wanted to bring up while we're here, and the Dretch is actually a perfect jumping off point. Is you know, I want to talk to you sort of about, like, cookie cutter black and white monsters, black and white bad guys, and how much we both hate them.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a guy that my players, and when he appeared, it was just him with two Dretches on either side of him. They, like, opened up a tomb. Here's this, like, sort of elf-looking guy, completely naked, with two Dretches. And I've actually played this with a couple different groups, this little scene. And all the elf-like creature, all he says is, I want to leave the dungeon. Like, I don't want to fight you guys. I've been trapped in here for 100,000 years. Not really that long, but a long time. Maybe it has been that long. I don't know. Very long time. All he wants to do is leave. And then the players are stuck with the dilemma, like, well, this guy's not trying to fight us, but he's with these really gross creatures. And every single group I played through have said, well, kill those demons that are with you and you can go. And then he slices open their throats with his hands. And then everyone's like, oh wait, should we let this guy go? And he'll just calmly start walking out of the dungeon while the players are arguing over what to do with him. And it's just funny to see, having played through this game, I think 3 times, maybe 4. Every time they let him go while arguing. One time someone took a blast at him, and it was someone playing a pacifist wizard. And he was like, how are we letting this guy go? And he blasted him once as the guy disappeared out the door. And so what I think added to that so much is like, here's someone that doesn't look like he'd be a bad guy, but he's with these creatures that look like he's a bad guy, but he's willing to just get rid of them if the players let him move on. And then the creepiest thing is the players go into the room that he was trapped in, and all there are just a ton of bones of these Dretch demons, and he's been living off of summoning these creatures for 100,000 years and just killing them and eating their flesh. And that's how he's survived in this room alone. And the truth is this guy he's not actually evil. He just did what he had to do while he was trapped in there. Not evil, but I'd say, sort of questionable. He has a questionable origin story. But anyways, with that description, I would hope, I'd hope that we could somehow capture that in the description of the Dretch, so that way people don't just pick them up and throw them into a room as, here's, go kill 5 Dretches,
Right. Well, you might have just written the story from experience, in a sense. We tell that little story that there was a group of adventurers that encountered one and came back to tell the story, and just tell what you just did. That's exactly my point, that making these little snippets of story brings the creature to life. And I think telling it in first person makes it interesting too, because rather than such and such a creature is covered in boils and translucent skin, it becomes, in this darkened room, this creature emerged. I noticed first that it's translucent skin. We get to tell it from a perspective, so that the reader can sort of get that sense of what it feels like to be in the presence of this creature. So I do want to mention one thing. That's a couple years ago when I did the monster panel at I believe that was LibertyCon, correct? Or am I mistaken? I believe it was. I apologize to LibertyCon if I'm wrong there, but
Mid-South-Con is when you're on panels.
Mid-South-Con. Okay. So one of them was making effective monsters, antagonists, and I was making this sort of argument about I don't like to throw out terms like evil, because I think it simplifies these creatures that probably are much more complex than that. But one person on the panel, another person on the panel, and I apologize, I don't remember who it was, but they made a point that I didn't take too much note of at the moment, but over time it's sort of stuck with me, and it's this idea of the unknown terror, the force that has no motive. That and there is something terrifying about something. For instance, you think of like Michael Myers from the Halloween stories. He has no motive. There's no relatability. He's just a force of pure evil. And the very fact that you can't relate with this evil is what makes it terrifying. So I only mention that to say there may be, and I don't know if we want to use that at all. I'm just saying that I'm not entitled, because you said we hate the black and white thing. I think there can be exceptions. uh, uh, um,
But
and I still, even in that, I don't like maybe a better example might be these forces of personified forces of nature, the forces of chaos and terror that or you think of stuff like Lovecraft, these ancient entities that that they may have their own set of reasoning, but humanity is not going to understand it. We're not going to find a relation. You couldn't necessarily, can't necessarily, you could, but it's not necessarily what a lot of people would define as an evil. It's just something motivated by its own uh, forces. But I guess the key there is that it's not relatable. It's not something that a person can say, well, it, was, it just needed to eat. It was just trying to protect itself or what have you.
Right. Well, I mean, Mike Myers was a mental issue. I mean, he did have mental, it wasn't like he was metaphysically evil, that he had a demon inside of him that came down that made him alignment evil. But whenever something goes that far, it becomes unrelatable. Of course, D&D and other tabletop games and video games can remove you from that. I saw someone posted a list about like things that their character has done that was really crazy in D&D, and they were all completely gross. It was not stuff that was like fun, cool things like that. I feel that like me and you have done playing over the years. It was like beating people up with their own baby, and it's like I couldn't believe that people were like sharing this list on Facebook and it wasn't like a sponsored thing. Like one of my friends actually said, "Oh, number 8's pretty funny," and number 8 wasn't as gross as some of the other ones. But I thought, this is awful. Like what person allows their players to get this gross? And sure, if you're playing an evil campaign, like and if you're playing a campaign that's supposed to go dark like that, but I also have never found joy.
Right.
Like let's play a bunch of serial killers around the table. Like, no, I'm not very interested in that. That being said, if it was a thing like a group role-playing thing that was sort of like Dexter, which was a way to deal with your mental issues that is not just the joy of killing, the joy of watching things get hurt,
right.
Which I think is, it's a weird thing of like, I love horror movies. I love watching them. But like I've never understood the fetish of like people wearing like Charles Manson shirts or Charles Manson like belt buckles and stuff.
Well, I think the key, I've always been attracted to really dark fiction movies, so forth. But I think that, like, for instance, watching a horror movie, what I like is seeing a generally it's a good relatable person subjected to terrifying, terrible ordeals, and then coming through the other side, or not even. I mean, they don't necessarily have to live. I don't need a happy ending, but there has to be some redeeming factor where maybe they learn to face this darkness with some, they learn bravery through the story, and then they die in the end, but they still found something. There was a character development aspect there. And I think the worse you treat your good characters, sometimes the better, because it's more powerful. You as a writer, you take a good person and you beat them down until they have to make some terrible, horrifying decisions along the way. just become a worse person by the end, then I'm gonna feel empty at the end. You know, they have to have learned something. And again, that doesn't mean a happy ending. It just means there's been some character development. And I think that's the difference. You know, I used to struggle with that myself. Why, you know, as somebody who, um, you know, I do my best to be a good person and every day a better person than I was yesterday. Why am I attracted to these dark fictions? And but I don't struggle with it anymore because that's what I realized.
Right. Well,
There's no satisfaction in just watching some terrible person go through something terrible.
right. Well, so it's, what's the underlying story? You know, Rob Zombie is a good example. Like, I followed him through all of his movies. His are hard to get through. House of a Thousand Corpses, the sequel, is what's the sequel? What's the name?
Mike, I lost you for just a second.
Oh, am I back?
Kinda.
Danny? Someone must be running a microwave somewhere or something.
Let me try something.
Okay.
All right.
All right. You still there?
Yeah, are you talking about the Devil's Rejects?
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. I didn't catch that
part. For all the horror on in that film, the underlying story that was interesting to me was that in the beginning, like, they were the really bad guys, and then at the end, I mean, they weren't the good guys, but there's other people that were just as bad as them who were in places of authority, you know, like the police officer and stuff. And that was just an interesting, you know, it was a neat way to turn the viewers' point of view around on themselves, you know. And so, like, I enjoy something like that, but then I think that the creepiest thing I've ever seen of Rob Zombie is I saw him wearing a Charles Manson belt buckle, like a huge one, like out to a premiere. And I just thought, man, that's really gross, like wearing this. Like, you're like there's no doubt that this person is not a good person, you know. Like, Charles Manson never had that redeeming quality where he came back around and tried to do something in the world. And so why would you wear a belt buckle other than, like, are you trying to be edgy? Are you trying to be, you know, and so I feel it's that same thing when players do things, you know, like, I mean, I go back to that one thing of, like, beating an NPC up with its own baby. Like, I would just stop the game and say, why are you doing this? Like, what in you is making this have to come out, you know?
Right.
And is the gaming tabletop really the place to do it? And I guess maybe in some groups it is. Like, that's how people get that out, you know?
Right.
But I don't think that it's funny because we're writing like a dark world, but that's not at all what we're trying to have happen in our games, you know?
At least not at the hands of the protagonists. You know, that's, again, the distinction here. I mean, I don't think that's going to happen with anybody because that's just weird. But you know, you get what I'm saying. The dark stuff happens. And then, by the way, another little distinction I want to make there is because you mentioned the Devil's Rejects. There was, I like the idea of the flawed hero, or even and the anti-hero, and even the bad guys who come to find. There's some character development for some aspect of them. You know, you never like the whole person, but at least there's some character development. And I guess that's the key. There's no character development possible for somebody beating somebody with their own baby. That's somebody who just needs psychological help, you know? Um, and it's hard to come back from that. But there's one movie I won't mention because people watching probably don't need to see it. It's the most disgusting movie I've ever seen in my life, and it disturbed me deeply. And I don't even know what it was. 10 minutes in, I was like, this is too much, and I went to turn it off. But there was something where I'm just like, it was that morbid curiosity, like, okay, I got to see where this is going. Like, where could this possibly be headed? And it got worse. And then it got worse. And I was thinking, this is like, my God, what sick person could make this? And at the end of the movie, it had the most beautiful moment where, because it's about this dysfunctional family that just things go crazy off the rails, and they are all terrible human beings. But at the end, you see them come together to protect one another, and you see this love they have for one another because they're mutually flawed, because they're so sick and so disturbed, but all in their own ways. And over the movie, they come to realize this. It makes them come together at the end. And so even things like that, and we're way off topic right now. So, but yeah, I there just has to be something for me to grab onto with a protagonist.
I mean, I don't think we're off topic here because we're still setting the tone for what we want the monster book to be. I'm going to go ahead and jump into this because really what it was, this whole thing, the reason we started on a new webcast so early is I saw Justice League last night. And I went in with a completely open mind, like on the high from Wonder Woman, had enjoyed that. I liked Ben Affleck as Batman. And I was just reminded over and over again on how you don't create a bad guy while watching that movie.
Right.
He was lacking any personality, any real reason to be doing what he's doing. And I think, and this, I know how important Superman is to you. Like, I asked myself, when I left, Laura and I were talking, and Laura really didn't enjoy it. Like, I was puzzled by it because I felt like there's a bunch of near misses with personalities and flow. But I asked her, I was like, what was the underlying story then? And she's like, well, they had to kill the bad guy. And I was like, all right, Thor Ragnarok, what was the underlying story? And it was that, like, Thor's sister came in and just, like, blew up the mindset that, like, oh, yeah, here we are in Asgard, and we're all, like, good guys, and, we watch out over the universe. And, like, when she pulled down the ceiling to reveal the painting behind it of, like, the war that her and her father had been fighting to, like, unite these kingdoms, I was like, man, that's a fucking great villain, And basically it's the same sort of villain in this one with none of the, like, backstory.
Right.
Now, I don't know. I didn't hate it enough that I didn't do a bunch of reading last night on it. And I don't know how much you've looked into the film after seeing it. Have you at all?
It depends on what I've read.
Like Zack Snyder left and Joss Whedon came in, right? You knew that.
Yeah, because of tragedy.
But it was, but I think that Joss Whedon was going to be doing stuff with it anyways, wasn't he? The article I read said that he was working already with it, and then, and it didn't say, but it said because of personal things, Zack Snyder had to leave.
Mm-hmm.
But then Joss Whedon came in, started doing some reshoots, and then they came in and said they wanted a 3-hour movie to be made into 2 hours, which to me really explains a lot, because I felt like the editing was really rough, but I think what it was is,
I'm sorry.
What's that?
Again, the thing is happening again. Well, and by the way, yeah, a lot of those jokes I think you could tell were Joss Whedon, although normally I think he's pretty decent at the humor, and this one I felt like every joke in the movie fell flat. But you know, I actually really, really enjoyed Justice League. It is in my top 5 comic movies, but I don't disagree with anything you said either. Here's the thing. Something that's happening with age is, or just maybe it's my level of busyness. You know, I'm always working on 100 different things. And then in my free time, I try to read books, catch up on stuff I've been trying to read. And so sometimes when I go and see a movie, I just want to turn the brain off and be entertained, you know? And I didn't used to be like that, but as I get older, I am. And in that way, I felt like they nailed it because some of those action scenes felt like they were lifted right off the page of a comic in a way that I don't think I've seen done in a movie before. It really, you know, these exhilarating action scenes. But basically what would happen is I see some action scene and I get excited. I'm like, yes, that's perfect. They nailed it. And then it shows the bad guy and I'm like, oh well. But see, that's the key. Like that, oh well, like, Then they make a joke and I'm like, oh, that was awful. Ouch. Oh well. Back to the good stuff. You know, if I'm analyzing the movie, it was terrible. It really was. But I enjoyed it by dismissing all those things that I didn't like instead of analyzing them. I didn't sit and think about it. No, they missed an opportunity. But I did see that I want to say it was a cinematographer, somebody who worked on the movie, made a comment that, you know, they want to see a director's cut because, yeah, apparently they're, like you said, they and you're right, you can tell that. Some of the CGI, well, the CGI with the bad guy, it looked fake. It looked like a video game. He was a terrible bad guy. I'm tired of cubes that are going to destroy the world.
Right. Right. Well, and Superman's upper lip, that was killing me.
Yeah, right. There is so much wrong with it.
Just tell me that he grew a mustache while he was in the damn coffin. That was awful. Like, I mean, I've seen video games do better jobs of making like lips move.
Right. Yeah, there was so much wrong with it, and yet I overlooked all of it somehow.
Well, see, and that was the thing. Is there's so much that kept pulling me out of like being able to sit there and enjoy it. You know, like a better comparison, because I think that Thor Ragnarok was a lot of fun. I came out of that one just like really excited and just like, you know, yeah, I want to see another Thor movie. So I think it'd be closer to compare Justice League to like Captain America Winter Soldier. I do not care about Captain America at all. Never interested me as a character. Nor his like friendship with Bucky. Like, I don't know, like all of that going in, I'm like rolling my eyes. But when I left, I was like, oh, like it all worked. And I just think that it really failed with putting scenes together and making things work. And it could have just been the editing down that made all the social scenes seem so weird, you know, like it made it seem so Hollywood, you know, like, you know, oh, Aquaman walks in, throws the guy on a table because that's what you do, walk over, grab a bottle, say drinks on him, then walk back out and pose in front of water. And it was just like, it was so contrived that it pulled me out. And I'm like, man, I love Jason Momoa. All he had to do is just like walk in and like set the guy down in a seat. Not throw him, like, come on, you throw him on anyone's table in a bar, everyone's not just going to be like, whoa, what just happened? You know, like, no, you stand up and be like, what the fuck are you doing? You know?
Right. Well, you know, some of the things people are praising, they bugged me. Like, The Flash was a caricature to me. I did not think he was funny. There was a moment or two, But yeah, that's one of the things people are praising. They really like the Flash, but I felt like he was a caricature of you know, somebody with a neurotic disorder. It was like making fun of people with those sorts of problems, and um, that's not just me being a social justice warrior or whatever. It just, I didn't find it funny. A lot of people did. Although I still have high hopes for the Flash movie.
I enjoyed the stuff with the Flash, just I think because it reminded me of a friend. Um, but I also think that they spent time with the Flash that they didn't spend with other people. Like they just, like when there's moments with Flash and Superman as well, like those were the two that I think that they really spent time giving us like sort of some inner thought with them, you know, like, oh, like this is like when the Flash realized that he can like run quickly and push the sword over to help them battle, like
Right.
I thought, oh wow, that's really great.
Oh,
like,
I loved that. I loved that. Just the jokes. I just meant the jokes.
Right.
Except the one where all the superheroes disappeared, because that's such a common thing that's always bugged me in super, and they made fun of that, you know, that they always just, the person turns around and when they turn back they're gone. It's such a cliche, and they sort of turn the cliche on its head. That moment I liked. That was a good joke, but
Well, so that's the struggle, isn't it? Is to turn the cliches on their head. To, you know, we're putting out a creature compendium that's going to sit on a shelf with like 30 other creature compendiums. You know, like if we were smarter guys, we'd probably be like scared to do this. But, you know, I mean, screw it. The first book we put out was the book about elves, and that went over well. So,
yeah.
But, you know, I mean, that's a hard thing. And let's say, I think, you know, me and you had a working relationship of, you know, 30 years now at this point almost. So we work well together. We're something like Joss Whedon and Zack Snyder. Like, how different of a vision could you have?
Yeah.
And then one of them took over for the other. Just like with the Hobbit movies, taking over from Guillermo del Toro to Peter Jackson, like their aesthetic and their view is so different. And I still think that if Del Toro had finished up The Hobbit, it would have been completely different.
Oh yeah.
It would have been more fantastical. It would have been more like the kid's story where it's supposed to be, where Legolas running up bricks that are floating in the air would be acceptable, rather than like the labored shots that Peter Jackson loves, where you're just like, oh man, like here's another slow-mo of something that's going to defy physics, you know?
Right.
But
well, hey, we have 15 minutes left, so I'm getting some feedback now.
Okay, try now.
Test. Still getting some feedback.
Okay, now?
Test. There we go. So, yeah, just to wrap that up, I definitely agree. We certainly got off topic this time. The point of this was the bad guys in those stories, and we're in agreement there. Justice League was incredibly weak, and that's what we want to avoid, is this one-dimensional bad guy that has no story, no depth, and is poorly CGI'd. and you know, I've seen some criticism of the Thor Ragnarok villain too. I'll see if I can find this article I came across, and I want to say I read it. I forget it. I want to say it made a couple good points, but I agree with you. There was, I liked her. I thought she did well and accomplished more of what we want to accomplish. But I did want to go through. What I have here isn't perfect. But this is. I just want to mention. I told you that I'd like to build a framework that we can use to build these monsters. basically my first thought, not every creature in the catalog is going to be something we want to invoke fear necessarily. If we have wolves in there, they're wolves, right? Although you seem to make them a little more intelligent in Athletes. But regardless, that's that there's not going to be a sense of foreboding with those. But in the cases where it is that kind of monster, I thought about fear. What is it that invokes fear in people? And a lot of this is me looking at myself. What are the things that have unsettled me when I've been reading books or watching movies or playing a game? And I started listing them, and all the different types of fear that can be invoked by creatures. And then I walked away and I started thinking about it, and it hit me that they fall into these sort of categories. Now, they don't work perfectly so far, but it's a good way of thinking about it, and a good way of sort of separating them out. And what I have is, first you have and this is the most common thing, the relatable fears that are mundane, the things that we fear on a regular basis. That's the fear of mortality, and I call this the fear of the known, because we know that these things, we live with these things every day. The fear of mortality, the fear of pain and suffering and torture. And in some of these cases, I have some examples like pain, suffering, torture, Hellraiser. That's the fear. Well, there's a lot of other fears too, but of course with Pinhead, it's all about the suffering. Oh no. Okay, lost you for just a second. You have the fear of just utter loss, the loss of everything in your life that's important to you, your loved ones and so forth. Something like The Mist. And then the relentless terror. Now, it also fits in the unknown, but Halloween. But that's that relentless terror, just something coming after you and you have to run. But these are all fears we can understand. Those tend to be the fears in action movies, your typical fantasy and sci-fi. But if you want to dig a little deeper, that's when you get into the fear of the unknown. That's more horror movie territory, I think. It starts with your basic fear of darkness, the fear of the future. Every step we take in life, every moment, we don't know what happens in the next moment. And there really is I think a fear that we push down, that we all live with, that we don't know what's about to happen. And that's something that a lot of horror movies play with, the afterlife. Nobody knows what the afterlife is. So there are all kinds of ways that are explored there. Ghost stories, the undead stories, and so forth. And I started with just those categories, but then it hit me. There's this fear of like an existential fear of being entirely wrong, or of severe change to where nothing makes sense anymore. So a fear of metamorphosis. That would be the Kafka, the story called The Metamorphosis, or, any Cronenberg story. You have this sort of body change that happens in a lot of the Cronenberg stories that's terrifying. Basic confusion and distrust. The Thing was my example there. That's the fear. The monster's scary, but it's not knowing who is the monster, not being able to trust the people around you that creates the real fear in that movie, that makes it so powerful. The disintegration of a person's grip on reality. Examples there are Amityville and The Shining. That's what's terrifying about The Shining. You have this father who's coming after the family. Yeah, the movie The Shining, not the book. But in the movie, yeah, it's that. It's the real fear is that he's not who we thought he was. It's that unknown. and the and then a disintegration of structure. Any disaster or apocalypse story. Now you have to, that's what's scary about it, is what does life mean now in this new world? You know, I thought I knew how to navigate it. Now I don't. The loss of self, lycanthropes, and possession, The Exorcist. I think each of these progressive categories, and I have one more, each progressive category gets a little deeper into the soul, you know, scares you a little more deeply. And the thing about this existential fear of getting it all wrong and not being who I thought I was and all of that, I think the power of it is, if I realize that I or others aren't quite what they say they are, if I'm wrong about that, then I could be wrong about everything. So I think of like the sweater that, you know, you pull the string and now the whole sweater starts to unravel. That's the worldview. That's, you know, crap. If I was wrong about that, you know, if you know, my family turns out to be imposters and I've been getting fooled all along, if I got that wrong, then nothing makes sense anymore. Nothing, I can't assume anything is real anymore. And that, I think, starts to get even more terrifying. And I don't know how those necessarily will apply to monsters. Again, this is just a thought experiment at first, but then I realized I need a whole separate category for the fear of being alone. And I mentioned in the last one of these we did that the torture of being smeared, this is terrible, but being smeared with honey and then put it into a hollowed out log and then put into like a still water, like a swamp, and letting the bugs get attracted to the I've always wondered, what is it about that just gets to me? And I realize that's at least a component of it, is if you're surrounded by people being tortured, there's still a sense that you're not alone, right? But if you're just left, if you're just put in a hollowed out log and left for days with nothing but the bugs that are now eating you, my God, that's like mixing the torture with solitary confinement. And I include in there, and I don't know if it fits perfectly, but I include in there the loss of the soul. Because I think when we think of the soul, we think of and you know, I don't mean the metaphysical soul. You know, but in horror stories, that is a common theme. You know, the Faustus story, the Crossroads, Angel Heart is a great example of that one. I think that's a terrifying movie. Maybe it fits in the other one a little better. Like I said, these aren't all perfect, but the more, you know, I think of like Angel Heart, and as it goes, he's feeling more and more isolated, you know, as he gets closer and closer to his ultimate doom, which is going to be damnation. And damnation is the ultimate solitude. And I think that's where it gets, I think that's the pinnacle. I think so. The pinnacle of terror is the idea of utter isolation for eternity. You know, the eternal hell of isolation. Now, when it comes to horror versus, you know, action and fantasy and sci-fi, like I said, a lot of action, and, you know, that's more of the standard mundane, just fear of mortality. Somebody's out to get me and I have to win. Usually we tend to incorporate some of these other elements more often. But one example I thought is Hannibal. If Hannibal was just a serial killer, he would still be scary. There are serial people can die, right? The protagonist can be killed by the serial killer. But Hannibal hits on these deeper fears because he gets in your head. You know, because he's a genius psychiatrist who can manipulate you. And you don't know if you're doing what, if your actions are your own choice or if it was really his choice. He can manipulate others against you. You know, those are the real, you know, if you're digging a little deeper, those are the real fears. And my final thing here is to add, if we're adding depth and story to some of these creatures, I think filtering them through all these different types of fear can give us the beginning of a framework. Like I said, I think we should work on this framework and you know, get your thoughts on it. I'll put it in Google Docs. And like I said, the fear stuff isn't going to work for everything, so we'll have to come up with some other stuff. But maybe we don't need it for everything. Like I said, as long as we come up with a good story and make it immersive. But the other way I realized of adding a little bit of depth, or one other way at least, is, and I think you made an allusion to this earlier, the ethical dilemma. So the player in the campaign realizes that these goblins, and I'm sorry, we haven't worked out. Well, I'm using goblin as a generic term here, not our goblins. But although I did, making this note was inspired by your old drawing that you did of the goblins. But the player realizes that these goblins are just simple creatures who are attacking out of fear. But that fear is leading them to kill people. So what's to be done about that? You know, if I'm a player, do I kill the lycanthrope, or do I hunt for a cure while risking further attacks? Because the longer that this person lives without the cure, the more people might die, you know? So what do I do? So those are, so amping up the fear, I think, is one way of you know, what is it that's scary? I think that's one way of adding to the monsters. And another way is the ethical dilemma. And I think we can probably come up with some more.
So I think one of the things, a lot of what you're talking about with this is actually less for a creature compendium and more for like a storyteller's guide or a game master's guide. You don't think so?
No, because I think, so let's say that we're looking at the Upir, and we're trying to think of what the story is. What's that little, I'm not talking about writing an extended piece. I'm just saying we want to write a couple of paragraphs about, you know, the encounter, you know, some encounter with the creature in order to bring it to life. We look at the creature's stats and we say, these are its strengths, these are its weaknesses. Now, if I encounter this creature, what am I going to be afraid of? That's where this list will come in handy. And what might be an ethical dilemma that we would have to face in encountering it. And so I'm just saying that this is a lens through which to look at all of these creatures individually. Are there elements of fear that we can amp up? Are there elements of ethical dilemma? And there might be some other things that we can think of.
Yeah. I guess I was thinking when it's me and you working together, these sorts of things come up naturally, you know, like to come up with a creature that, you know, is not all bad. They're just trying to survive, or so on, or the fear, because the Upir has the ability to to charm somebody. And if they miss their charm, then they can be charmed for, you know, days on end until they finally make their save on the charm. There's definite weaknesses to being an Oupir. You know, like if you feed on someone long enough, then which tends to make most very old Oupirs completely batshit crazy. Not that they can turn into bats, but so I guess I was thinking like me and you are probably going to do that anyways because we always naturally do that. But I do think that going into the depth like this, like a whole section in, you know, a game master's guide, and I'm sure there's a lot of them out there, but you know, like we all have our different points of views on how to bring that to the table, how to, I mean, because really like that of course is going to come into play when we're writing our small bits, but then if we like come up with this code of things to looking over to put it in a chapter or put it out as just a small like, you know, mini book for the GMs to say, here's how you can take, you know, because really like at this point, you know, Tolkien loved werewolves, and often the scariest guys had werewolf powers. Sauron was a werewolf. These days, we think more of werewolves as like the sexy, hairy guys hanging out with the sexy vampires, you know. And so it takes a lot for the players at a table to get away from that. So it's the GM having to, you know, to put that out in the crowd interested, I guess, or get their minds switched over from what we see. You know, the same with dwarves. At this point, and this is why most people don't work with these sort of old cliche things that we are still, you know, me and you look at it as a challenge, like how do we make this more interesting? Other people are like, no, I don't want this stuff, you know, like, oh, what's a dwarf? He's going to make silly jokes and have a beard and, you know, like he's going to drink a lot. And it's like, well, yeah, they could do that, but who are they really? You know, let's go 3 steps deeper. So I think it is good to have, you know, sort of something for us to look over. And I'm really interested to see how you classify some of these things, you know, and even, you know, we could have a small section in the monster manual. I mean, maybe like I'd say maybe a limited section in the monster manual and then a larger section in a game master's manual where like, you know, like in game where, you know, your character is talking about why these creatures are scary. You know, so that way like the players reading it can get a feel for it, but then the GM's book, you can really go out there and really make it expansive to say, here's like, just really keep this in mind. Some books that I think have been the most exciting to me are the ones that do that, like with Pathfinder, Occult Adventures did such a good job of building flavor that it added flavor to my game immediately. Where rules don't tend to do that. You know, you just read some rules, you read like, how many times can someone tell me what a dungeon is? It's like, I know what a dungeon is. Can we move on, you know? But of course, then sometimes I skip over that stuff. And if there's new players playing, then they need that in the book. So,
you know, the thing you said about the Uber, by the way, I think is a perfect example of, I'm getting that feedback again. But the charm. So, in my experience, when you're playing an RPG and somebody gets charmed, oh crap, I got charmed. Well, I'm out of commission, and now I guess I get to attack you guys for a few rounds. Now, there's nothing right or wrong about that method. But if you think about it, let's say that these were real human beings who venture into this lair of this creature, and suddenly one of them is acting has no agency anymore over their own body, and mind. They've been completely overtaken. would that be? You know, when you come back, you would be traumatized. You know, that would be, now I'm not saying you can't go that far in games where people are traumatized, but it is something to think about. And if you're writing a description of a new peer, you should probably mention that, you know, if you tell the story of an encounter, how terrifying was it that you lost control of your faculties for a little bit, you know, and maybe even attacked somebody that you care about.
I think
That's the perfect example. And that's why I like to think of the psychological aspect of, you know, what are we really, you know, you can just use your imagination and come up with all sorts of powers that a creature might have. But if you want them to be memorable, to affect a person, you have to think about what is it really in an abstract sense that affects a person. You know, those elements of fear being one of those things. So it's just really all of this is and I agree with you that we can lay all this out too for game masters. But this is how I generally, this is my creative process right here. This is what I tend to do. I start with maybe an idea, and then I back up and I think, what's the essence? What am I really trying to achieve? What is the reaction that I want that person to have? You know, and now that I have that in mind, now that I understand that, I can start to build on that. So so yeah, the oop here is a perfect example of that.
Awesome.
Now it's going to be difficult because, you know, how do we get that across in a couple paragraphs? You know, if we don't.
Well, but you can, and that's one of the drawbacks of D20 really is, and how do you get that across the table? And you know, like there's so many different things that like it's hard to get going at a table, you know, especially when there's dice involved, there's a lot of stats involved, you know, there's other more story-based games that are better. And one of the other things is, you know, you can get some of this across if there's more likelihood of the players dying, you know, like
Right.
One of the things you don't want to do in your gaming is make a player die or a player be charmed for the whole hour that they committed to coming over to your house.
Right.
Because, you know, it's already hard enough getting a bunch of adults over to your house on the same night to play a game, like, you know, on the reg. And then when they do show up, it's like, oh, nope, right away, you know, you're put over here. And,
right.
So, you know, it's finding that balance. And oftentimes, you know, this can be done through NPCs. You get NPCs that people care about. And then those guys can get in the big trouble too. You know, there's lots of ways around it. But really, with the creature compendium, it's about giving the palette to start with. You know, one of the new adventures I'm working on has random encounters, and it's like, oh man, like all of these, like if they roll on this chart, they have to know what all I'm pulling from my palette, you know, to the game. So that way, like it's not just, you know, oh, some bandits were dropped down. Well, how are these guys interesting, you know? And of course, that can make it much more of a much larger adventure, or much more a bigger project than just saying, here's some creatures to slow them down, you know. And you know, it really comes down to play style too. You know, some people love just the random encounter, you know, playing, you know, D&D more like a game like Descent, where there's just, you know, here's a random board,
Right.
here's random creatures, you roll dice, you enjoy the game part of it, less so than the role-playing part.
But you know, I think you can, you know what, I think that people can play that way if they want and still enjoy a little bit of flavor in the book.
Right. And if they don't enjoy the flavor, then they go on to a different game that has less flavor and more stats, you know.
Right.
If you love numbers, go to Pathfinder. You know, if you love having 5,000 rule books to keep up with, go to Pathfinder. I guess that's the great thing about where the indie gaming world is now, is all of our options are out there. You can choose whatever you want, you know.
Yeah.
But everyone should choose Sagaborn.
All right.
Well, I think we covered quite a lot tonight.
Yeah, we were
More
going
than
to
the
keep
creature
this one
compendium for
short. We're at
sure.
an hour and 10 minutes.
Yeah. So I guess we'll be signing off for tonight. And thanks for watching.